Hey there, and welcome back to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr. Nerida, professional equine nutritionist, horse mum to a little herd of 7 equines, and avid identifier of dangerous grasses in horse pastures. So today we're talking about something that catches a lot of good horse owners out, and that is the often unidentified danger of high-oxalate warm season grasses that will interfere with calcium absorption and over time weaken your horse's bones and put them at extreme risk of fracture. These dangerous grasses are so common, and the tricky part is that horses can look totally normal for quite a while. Then tragically, the first you know about an issue is your horse will end up with a life-ending fracture of a leg or pelvis. I don't want that happening to anyone's horses. So in this episode, I'm going to explain what oxalate is and what it does inside your horse, why the body starts pulling calcium out of bone and weakening it, how to spot the most common grasses, how to identify the early signs you might notice in your horse, and we'll go over what your most sensible prevention options are to help you keep your horse safe. All right, let's get into it. So horses are natural grazers, and it's not instinctive, I guess, to watch a horse eating what its most natural food source is and think that that could be dangerous for your horse. But the reality is there are some grasses, and they're typically all grasses, at least in Australia, they're typically all grasses that have been introduced here for ruminants, predominantly for cattle. So they're very, very productive grasses. They grow a lot of dry matter, and they enabled farmers and beef cattle farmers to be able to increase their stocking rate on country that would have otherwise not been able to carry that many cattle. They're incredible grasses. They grow quickly. They give you a massive bulk of pasture, so they're great from that perspective. But unless you're aware of what these grasses are and what they actually contain and why that's dangerous for your horses, the reality is, and it's heartbreaking, I see it so many times, that you end up with a horse that has either already had a fracture or they're so badly affected that it's really, really difficult to bring them back to full health after they've been badly affected by these grasses for such a long period of time. I guess the most important thing to become aware of here is what these grasses are so that you can identify them in your horse's pasture and know whether you need to take additional steps in your horse's feeding program to protect them. And the second part, which is actually the first bit I'm going to talk about, is understanding the process of how these grasses affect your horses. So let's look at, because it's such a weird concept, isn't it? Like, how does grass destroy bone? And like I said, if you're not aware of this even being a possibility, there is no way you would look at some grasses and go, oh, that grass is going to destroy my bone. But that's literally what they do. And the way they do that is these warm season grasses, they go by many names. So we in Australia, in fact, tend to call them subtropical grasses. I don't necessarily like calling them that because it makes people think that these grasses are in our tropical or subtropical regions, and that's not the case. So you can be in very temperate regions and even in cold temperate regions and still have horses that are at high risk of these grasses because the grasses are everywhere and they will grow during your warm seasons. So that is why I like to call them the warm season grasses, which is more common. That's how they're referred to in North America commonly. I typically like to refer to them as that because even if you're in a temperate or cold climate during your warm seasons, so your summer months, you can still have these grasses and your horse can still be at risk of these grasses. And in fact, I've seen the most dangerous grass, setaria, which I'll talk about in quite a lot of detail. I've seen it growing on a friend's property in Armidale, which is at an elevation of 1,000 metres. It snows up there, and yet they still have this setaria grass growing there in summertime. So don't fall into the trap of thinking, I'm in a temperate region or a cold area and therefore my horse is not at risk. Keep listening because you may actually find out that you do have some of these grasses and you do need to take steps to protect your horse. So these warm season grasses contain a compound called oxalate. And the oxalate, perfectly normal and natural part of the grasses, but because of oxalate's structure, it actually loves to grab hold of calcium. So calcium has got a positive charge, the oxalate is a negative charge, and they are attracted together. And when they bind together, the bond is so tight that any calcium that the oxalate actually grabs hold of in your horse's gut, it makes that calcium unavailable for absorption. So the calcium in your horse's diet can be bound by oxalate, and in fact the calcium within the grass itself gets bound by the oxalate, and then your horse can't absorb it into its body, and it gets dragged out of your horse's body and ultimately ends up in your horse's manure. I also strongly suspect, we don't have evidence in horses, but in humans and lots of other species, I strongly suspect that at least some of that oxalate gets absorbed into the horse's body, and then will end up in your horse's blood and will scavenge around and actually attract, like iron filings to a magnet, the calcium out of your horse's blood and take it out of your horse's body via the kidneys as calcium oxalate. And there's actually medical conditions in humans, and I should have looked up the name of them, but it's kidney stones, bladder stones, that is an accumulation of calcium oxalate. And if you read about the preventative dietary measures in humans for those conditions, the recommendations are to avoid high oxalate food ingredients. So a lot of fruits and vegetables that we eat are actually high in oxalate. So things like spinach, strawberries is one that comes to mind that is high oxalate. And we're often not, if we don't have issues with kidney stones, we're often not aware of the problem existing because not all humans are prone to it. But the fact that to reduce that condition in humans requires the human to reduce the oxalate in their diet so that they don't have the oxalate in their body to create the calcium oxalate, makes me really suspicious that the horses are actually absorbing the oxalate and then that oxalate is dragging calcium out of their body. And the other thing that makes me very suspicious of that happening is that the more dangerous grasses, so the grasses like setaria that contain proportionally much higher levels of oxalate than the other dangerous grasses, you'll see problems occurring on those grasses a lot faster. And it doesn't make logical sense to me that if the only method of causing calcium deficiency was that they were binding the calcium in the diet, if that was the case, I would think that all of the grasses would probably cause the problem at the same rate. Whereas setaria, I know personally of broodmares, and unfortunately I only found out years after it had happened, but broodmares that had foals at foot, so they were lactating, massive calcium requirements, and the person that owned them moved them from a central Queensland property where there were no high oxalate grasses out to the coast, thinking that they were doing them a favour and bringing them out to the lovely lush green coastal pastures, and they actually died in 6 weeks. So it created such severe calcium deficiency in 6 weeks that these mares actually passed away from calcium deficiency. It's tragic. But the setaria, and there's lots of other cases over the years where, I know of setaria causing very severe problems in a matter of months, whereas the other grasses tend to take a longer period of time to start causing problems. And I think that those really high oxalate grasses, if the horses are actually absorbing some oxalate and then it's dragging calcium out of the body, you will see the problem a lot faster if that was part of the way that these grasses affect horses. So like I said, no scientific evidence. I would love someone to actually do a study on that and look at calcium oxalate in horses' urine for horses that were on high oxalate grasses versus horses that are on temperate grasses that don't contain any oxalate. But if anyone's listening and wants to do a cool research project, I'd happily be involved in that with you if you wanted me to be. But yeah, I think it's something that there needs to be a lot more work done. But what we do know is if we put horses on these grasses without correct calcium supplementation, they will almost always end up with calcium deficiency, and it causes a disease that its long name is nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism. We don't very often call it that. It usually gets called by its very common name, which is Bighead disease. Because of the oxalate structure, it grabs hold of calcium. It prevents your horse from being able to absorb calcium, and I also think that the horse absorbs some of the oxalate, and then that oxalate also drags calcium out of your horse's body. So that's the first part of the problem. The second thing that we need to understand to really get why these grasses are so dangerous for our horses is that your horse's blood calcium level needs to be maintained in a really, really tight range. And that's because muscles rely on calcium for correct contraction and relaxation. Now, when you think about the muscles in your horse's body, their heart is a muscle. So if they let their blood calcium level drop too low, their heart wouldn't be able to contract and relax, and that obviously would be a total disaster. So throughout evolution, and most animals do this as far as I'm aware, the body has created a really, really clever system where the bones store calcium. And anytime blood calcium levels drop a little bit low, the blood says to the bone, hey, can I borrow a little bit of calcium? We're a little bit short at the moment, but as soon as we have more, we'll pay you back. And the bone goes, sure, you can have a little bit of my calcium. So the bone lets go of a little bit of calcium into the blood. The blood calcium level is restored. Everything carries on as normal. The heart continues to beat. All the other muscles continue to contract and relax as they should. And then when the horse eats something that has got plenty of calcium in it, the blood goes, oh, here we go, we've got some excess calcium, put it back into their bank of calcium in the bones. So the blood is literally using the bones like a calcium bank. Sometimes they'll make a withdrawal, other times they'll make a deposit. And in a healthy situation, so in a situation where there's not something that is affecting calcium supply, or, not in this situation, something that's actually dragging calcium out of the body, the blood will always pay the bone back enough calcium. So the bones never get depleted in calcium. They maintain a really healthy bank balance of calcium. When horses graze these high oxalate pastures, however, what happens is that the oxalate binds the calcium in the horse's gut. So the horse is not absorbing calcium from their pasture. And I will just note here too that hays are also, warm season hays that are high in oxalate will also do exactly the same thing. So if you use a bermudagrass hay or teff hay, they're probably the two most common high oxalate grass hays, they will do the same thing. The oxalate operates in exactly the same way as does in the pasture. So if your horse is either grazing these high oxalate pastures or eating a high oxalate hay, they're not absorbing any calcium. And blood calcium levels will eventually drop. And the blood does the same thing. It says to the bone, hey, I'm a little bit short on calcium. Can I borrow some? And the bone says, sure, you can borrow some. Because the bone knows that it needs to keep the animal alive. That's the most important aim in this situation, is give the horse calcium from the bone so that the heart can keep beating and the horse stays alive. But the problem is that the blood then has to go, oh, I'm a little bit short on calcium again. Can I borrow some? The bone says, sure, you can borrow some. And then again, I'm a little bit short on calcium. Can I borrow some? Bone says, sure, you can borrow some. But because the horse doesn't ever absorb calcium, or certainly doesn't absorb enough calcium if it's not being correctly supplemented in these situations, the blood is constantly borrowing calcium from the bone and it's never ever paying it back. Now, we all know what happens to a real bank account. If you're constantly taking money out and you're never ever putting it in, it runs out really quick. So this is what happens to your horse's bones. The blood is borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and not paying back. And the bone eventually gets so depleted of calcium and the bones become very weak, and your horse at this point in time is at extreme risk of bone fracture, to the point where I know multiple cases of broodmares, again, not necessarily lactating ones, but just this is the ones that have popped into my mind, but broodmares, they'd lie down to roll and they'd fracture their pelvis. And lots of horses over the years that end up with a broken leg, which sometimes was put down to bad luck. But, I'd become involved in one way or another, and we'd actually find that these horses had been on these high oxalate pastures and had become calcium deficient over sometimes an extended period of time, 6 to 12 months or longer. And the bones were so weak that the horses just fractured. And, they're severe fractures, and often the only option is euthanasia, which is so tragic for something that can be so easily prevented. So that's the physiology behind it. Essentially, the horse is calcium deficient. It needs to borrow calcium from the bones to maintain its blood calcium level, and eventually it borrows so much calcium from the bone that the bones become really weak. Now, the condition is called Bighead disease because in young horses, what happens when the bones become really calcium deficient is they kind of go spongy, and the facial bones in young horses will expand, and they get this very big head appearance. If you've ever seen a horse with big head, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But the name is actually really misleading because in mature horses, you won't normally see the big head appearance. What you'll normally see is a shifting lameness. So because their skeleton has become weakened, it also gets really sore. So, and especially if you've got a horse in work, they'll be lame. But the thing is, they'll be lame, let's say, on the near side front foot or leg. And so they'll favour that leg and be lame on it and make it do a little bit less work. But then they've made, say, the offside front leg sore now. So the lameness will shift to the offside front leg and it'll also shift to the hind legs. And it's really, really hard lameness to pin down. You just know that they are lame. When it gets a little bit more severe, they'll start to shuffle or move with a really funny gait because everything's sore. If you are getting into middle age like I am, you'll know what I mean. If you just think about when you get out of bed in the morning and your ankles are kind of tight and you're like, until you warm up your body a little bit. That's kind of what I imagine in my mind what a horse with reasonably advanced big head disease must feel like, because just everything hurts and they'll move with a gait where everything hurts. Now, they won't necessarily get to that, and that's part of the tricky thing with this condition is that so many horses that end up with this nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism, they present in lots of different ways. So sometimes what I see is that horses are just grumpy, they're unhappy, they're sour, and they don't want to be touched, which I think says that, you know, their muscles are sore, and potentially their muscles are sore because they're having to do so much work in supporting their very sore skeleton. It could be another reason altogether, but they don't like to be touched, so they can get very sour. You will sometimes hear, because of the changing structure in around their throat region, you'll sometimes hear that, particularly if you're working them, they'll make a loud breathing sound. If you hear a loud breathing sound in your horses, immediately look at what's in your pasture and, you know, how does your diet balance, and whether or not it could be that your horse has actually got big head disease and not some other respiratory condition. So please, if your horse is making a weird sound when you're working it, when it's breathing, do check for these grasses in your pasture or your hay, and also check and make sure that your diet is balanced properly for calcium. Hey, quick pause. If you're trying to figure out what to feed your horse, you don't have to do it solo. The My Happy Horse app helps you make sense of nutrition clearly, calmly, and without overwhelm. It's like having me in your pocket when you need reassurance the most. Visit myhappy.horse or grab it from the App Store. Okay, let's get back into it. The other thing that you'll often see in mature horses, you won't necessarily see the big head, like the very expanded appearance down over their nose, but what I commonly see is a ridge or a bump that runs somewhere between their eyes. It's not always in the same place, but it's like a big swelling sort of comes up and runs in a line somewhere between their eyes. So again, if you see that in your horses, do suspect that they may have big head disease and act really quickly to figure out what's in their pasture or hay and what the balance of calcium in their diet is. And we'll talk about balancing their diet in detail in a minute. So there's lots of different symptoms. It is a big part of the reason why it's so poorly recognised. I see so many horses that have got big head disease that have been diagnosed with some other conditions, and no matter what the horse owner does, they can't get the horse right because the underlying condition is not being treated. In some parts of the world, you can actually test for parathyroid hormone. So as the long name suggests, with hyperparathyroidism, they get a really elevated level of parathyroid hormone, which is the hormone that drives calcium absorption. So when the body realizes that it's not getting enough calcium, it upregulates this parathyroid hormone, and it tells the body to scavenge as much calcium as it possibly can, so absorb every bit of calcium that you can out of the diet. So if you can test for parathyroid hormone and you suspect that your horse may be affected by this disease, I really recommend you doing that. Unfortunately, we cannot use that test in Australia. There is something in the kit that our biosecurity won't allow into the country. We used to be able to do it. It kills me now that we can't do it because it's so hard to diagnose these horses. If anyone comes up with another way to diagnose them, I'd love to know about it. Please get in touch and let me know, because I'd really love to know. It would make life a lot easier when we can actually just diagnose these horses with a blood test. But you can't, I'll just mention here, you can't test blood calcium level. It will tell you nothing. So the fact that they're releasing calcium from their bone to maintain blood calcium level, you won't see a calcium deficiency in the blood because the body's working so hard to maintain that blood calcium level. So we need another way to actually diagnose. If we can't test for parathyroid hormone, we need another way to diagnose the condition. Okay, moving on from symptoms, which are varied. Actually, I'll just go back. There is a couple more that are good to understand. So some other symptoms are you may get dental issues. So as the bone sort of weakens around their jaw, their teeth can just fall out. So if your horse has got weird dental issues and you're not quite sure what's going on and you have these grasses in their diet, definitely suspect the problem. You may see a rough coat, but then a rough coat can be caused by so many issues, but just be aware that there may be a rough coat there. You may, when the disease is quite advanced, you may get unexpected or unexplainable weight loss, and it can also affect their hooves, so their hooves can be in quite poor condition. But keep an eye out for that soreness, the shifting lameness, the odd gait, any bony changes to the skull in young horses or mature horses, just being aware that they'll show up differently. So do be conscious of all of those symptoms, but it'll help you to also be able to identify, or at least know, what grasses are dangerous, and then try to identify the grasses. And there's so many resources, both online and also in real life. So lots of the departments of agriculture around the world, they've all got different names, but you'll know what I'm talking about, have got agronomists, and those agronomists are happy to help you generally identify grasses. So whether you take some grass into them or you have them come out to your property, if you're unsure of what the pastures are in your grasses, and particularly if you live somewhere that is subtropical, tropical, coastal, warm, wet, that's often where you'll find those grasses. But don't think you don't have them. Like I said before, just because you live in a cold temperate region, you may still have them. And in fact, I don't live in I'm kind of in the middle, I guess. I've got hot summers, cold winters, but no snow. And looking out my window at the moment, I can see the first grass I'll talk about, which is kikuyu. So kikuyu is one of the dangerous grasses, and it contains around 15 grams per kilogram of oxalate when it's in its high oxalate state. The oxalate level is highest when plants are in their young vegetative, very leafy green growing stage, and then it will decrease over time as they get more mature. So we tend to use a value of 15 grams per kilogram of oxalate on a dry matter basis in kikuyu. Distinctive features of kikuyu are it's usually bright green. It's almost a lime green colour when it's growing, and it grows in long runners. So if you grab it and pull at it, you'll often get what look like little grass ropes, and it grows in runners across the ground. And something really unique to kikuyu is that it never has visible seed heads. I think it might be the only grass, at least the only grass that I know of, that never has visible seed heads. So if you have this bright green leafy grass and you never see seed heads and it pulls up in runners or ropes, and chances are that's kikuyu. The second grass, very, very common in Queensland, in Australia. I don't know, it's probably also reasonably common in parts of Africa, I would imagine, but it's buffel grass. So it was brought in, as I mentioned earlier, as a very productive grass for beef cattle. And cattle have got the advantage that the grass goes into their rumen first, and then the rumen microbes actually break down the oxalate and release the calcium. So ruminants, they can be affected bioxalate, but they're certainly not as prone to it as horses are, because horses don't. They have their fermentation chamber at the back end of their gastrointestinal tract, and the microbes will break the calcium and the oxalate down there, but horses don't absorb calcium from their hindgut, so it's too little too late, I guess, from the horse's perspective for calcium absorption. So buffel grass is a darker green, can be almost bluish in colour when it's young and growing. Unlike kikuyu, it grows in a tussock, so it doesn't run along the ground. You'll see it in tussocks. It's probably its most distinctive feature is it's got seed heads like little bottle brushes. They're up to about 10 centimetres long, and they're frequently purplish in colour, and they really are. I was looking at some photos of the buffel grass, and in fact, if you have a look on the My Happy Horse website, which is myhappy.horse, and you go to the blog post that goes along with this podcast, I will put photos of all these different grasses there so that you can actually go and have a look and see if you can identify the grasses from photos. It's sometimes very difficult to identify grasses from photos because it's really hard to take a good photo of a grass to start with, and then they can look so varied. So if you're looking at your grass at a very different stage of maturity to the ones in photos that you might be looking at, then it is really hard to identify them. So like I said, if you're not sure, go and get someone who does know grasses well, being an agronomist, and see if they can help you to identify the grasses that you've got in your pastures. So that's buffel grass. Couch grass, which is also called bermudagrass in North America, is also what I would classify as a dangerous grass from an oxalate perspective. So couch is usually green in colour. It's almost like a greyish green sometimes when you look at it. At least the couch that I have here is the Bermuda grass that has been specifically grown for hay production is much bigger and leafier than the normal sort of lawn couch grass that a lot of you will know. It grows in a very dense lawn-like mat when it's growing well. It's incredibly resistant to overgrazing. Horses can absolutely hammer it and it'll still come back whenever it rains and gets a little bit of break from grazing. And it's a little bit like kikuyu in that it spreads in long runners along the ground. And again, if you pull at it, you'll often pull up these wiry stems. So they're much thinner than the kikuyu stems. If anyone is a gardener, I don't know whether I classify myself as a gardener, but I do garden, and I can't stand couch grass in my garden because it gets in and it's so hard to pull it out because it runs everywhere and there's tiny little fine stems that it has. And if you do pull some of it up, have a look at the joints. You'll see roots that are growing there like little pegs that kind of peg it down to the ground as it grows along the ground. So anyway, if you know couch grass, and especially if you wrestle with it in your garden like I do, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Something very distinctive about couch is its seed head. So when it does go to seed, the seed head looks like a little star or a windmill, or I often think about them more as it looks like an umbrella that's been in a massive storm, blown backwards so that it's like turned upwards instead of downwards, and the fabric's all blown off. So you've completely lost most of your umbrella, but you've still got the spiky little fingers upright. That's kind of what a couch seed head looks like. And they'll have anywhere from 3 up to 7 fingers radiating out from one point. And it is a distinctive feature of couch grass, being aware that there's lots of other grasses that have got seed heads like that as well. I've left the big bad one till the end, so setaria, and this is actually the grass that inspired me to do this podcast today, because we've just been on a road trip up the coast of New South Wales and into southern Queensland, and setaria is everywhere. Was brought in again as a ruminant feed. It's highly productive grass. It is that, I don't really know how to describe its colour. I would describe probably the setaria that I was seeing in the last few weeks sort of as a bright green and almost lime green, but when you read about it, it will also get described as being grey to blue to green in colour. So who knows what colour it is. Something that is really, really distinctive about setaria is that if you have a look at the very bottom of the tussock, so it's like buffel grass, it grows in a tussock, but if you have a look at the very bottom of it, it'll be almost in a fan shape, and it's usually got some red colour around the stems. That's quite distinctive. And then the other distinctive thing is that its seed heads are a really long bottle brush. So they can be anywhere from 8 up to 25 centimetres long. And they will vary in colour. So some sources say they can be purplish. I don't so much see the purplish ones. You sort of see more like the straw-coloured light brown ones, but they are very, very long. And that is a very distinctive thing too. And it's also a really tall grass. So it can actually reach up to 2 metres tall at maturity. Some of the setaria that I was taking some photos and videos of in the last few weeks, it was well over my head. So it would easily have been 2 metres tall. So it's a very tall grass. If you have this grass, so I mentioned kikuyu, we say has around 15 grams per kilogram of oxalate per kilogram dry matter. Buffel grass is around the same. Couch grass is a little bit less. I tend to use an amount of about 10 grams per kilogram dry matter of oxalate. Setaria can have anywhere from 35 up to nearly 80 grams of oxalate per kilogram of dry matter. So it's more than twice to over 5 times the oxalate in kikuyu and buffel grass. And kikuyu and buffel are dangerous grasses. If you don't supplement your horse correctly with calcium on those grasses, they will eventually end up with bighead disease. And setaria is many times more dangerous than those ones are. And as I already mentioned, I know personally of a case where it caused fatal calcium deficiency in 6 weeks in lactating broodmares. So if you have this grass, it is really important that you know you have this grass so that you can manage your horse in a way that prevents that severe and often very, very rapid calcium deficiency from occurring. If you're buying a horse property or thinking about buying a horse property, I would avoid anything that has this grass on it because it's so hard to manage, it's so hard to get rid of, and you'll spend the rest of your horsey days just trying to manage calcium intake in your horse. It really should be listed as a toxic grass for horses because it's deadly. If you leave them on it and you don't feed them properly, it will kill them. I know that's pretty blunt, but that's how it will go if you don't know that you have setaria and you don't correctly supplement them with it. And because it's got so much oxalate in it, it's actually quite difficult to supplement them properly. So I just created myself a nice little segue there to move into how do we supplement horses properly on these grasses. And in the case of nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism, prevention is always better than cure. So if you are listening to this and thinking, holy cow, my horse has already got this condition, I know that I have these grasses now, all is not lost. I have helped rehab many horses over the years back from being affected by this condition, so it is possible. If your horse does have this condition, I would say to you, you need help in creating a diet that will bring them back to health. There's a few places you can get that help. You can absolutely join our My Happy Horse nutrition app. And then I am there to help you, or one of our team is there to help you put together a diet properly for horses to rehab them back from bighead disease. Or find an experienced nutritionist to help you correct your horse's diet and feed them for recovery. So that may be a nutritionist with the feed company that you use, or there's lots of independent nutritionists around as well. Just make sure that they do have experience with this condition because it's not a super simple one to bring them back from. They get calcium deficient, but they also get very phosphorus deficient if they've had this condition for a period of time because the elevated parathyroid hormone actually makes them dump phosphorus out of their body as well. So they've got calcium deficiency, but then they also end up with phosphorus deficiency. So there's a little bit of understanding in how to bring them back, but it is definitely possible. So don't panic too much if you think your horse may be affected, but do act really quickly because time is of the essence. You need to get calcium and phosphorus back into their bones so that their bones can strengthen up and reduce the risk of fracture. If you think that you might have some of these grasses, or you listen to this and you go and get your grasses identified, and then you know that you have one of these grasses in your horse's pasture, or if you know that you're feeding teff hay, or you know that you're feeding bermudagrass hay, then you do need to be aware of how to balance a horse's diet properly. The overall premise is that the diet needs to contain calcium in a ratio of 0.5 parts calcium to 1 part oxalate to prevent the calcium deficiency that occurs from oxalate. So that means that for, say, kikuyu, if it's got 15 grams per kilogram of dry matter of oxalate, for every kilo of dry matter of that kikuyu pasture your horse eats, you need to be adding in 7.5 grams of calcium. So it sounds kind of simple, except that when you go to calculate it out by hand, it gets quite complicated because you need to work out how much pasture is my horse eating, how much calcium is coming into the diet already from various other feed ingredients. So you may be feeding some hay that is bringing calcium in. You may be feeding a fortified feed or a vitamin and mineral supplement that contains calcium. So all of that calcium needs to be taken into account. And then if there's still not enough calcium in the diet, we need to add additional calcium in on top. And then when we add calcium, you also need to be aware that if we add lots of calcium without also thinking about how that calcium is sitting in the diet in ratio to other minerals like magnesium and phosphorus, we create another set of issues. So we need to be adding in calcium, but also making sure that it's in the correct ratio with magnesium and phosphorus. So there's a few ways you can do that. One is you can feed a specialised balancer pellet that has been correctly formulated for horses on high-oxalate pastures. So I have formulated a couple of these over the years, and making sure that, there's lots of calcium, but also it's in the correct ratio with magnesium and phosphorus. You can also add a calcium supplement that's been formulated for this situation. Again, I've formulated a few of these over the years, and the same basic premise exists. So they'll bring in calcium, but a well-formulated supplement should also bring in magnesium and phosphorus to make sure that all of the mineral ratios stay balanced up. And the other thing you can do is add additional calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus to your horse's diet in raw materials that you get for yourself. So you can use limestone, you can use dicalcium phosphate or monocalcium phosphate. There's lots of different calcium phosphates available, but you can certainly use those, and they have the advantage of bringing in calcium and phosphorus for you. And you can use a high quality magnesium oxide. So magnesium oxide is a human created substance. It's made by heating magnesium at very high temperatures. There's a process called being calcined. And if it's done properly at the correct temperature, it creates a raw material that has nice bioavailable source of magnesium for horses. There's one in Australia called Causmag. It is typically the one that we will use in feeds and supplements, and the one that we would use in these situations if you're wanting to mix up your own mineral mix for these horses. So on a really, really approximate basis, for horses that are just on grass pasture, so for 500 kilogram horse just on grass pasture, you would need to add approximately, and I say approximately very much as approximately, these are rough guidelines, about 80 grams per day of limestone, around 50 grams per day of dicalcium phosphate, and around 20 grams per day of magnesium oxide. And also add a little bit of salt, so 10 grams of salt into that per day as well, because the sodium is important in there for lots of reasons, but I normally add a little bit of salt to that daily mineral mix as well. It really is crucial that you get the mineral levels in a diet right though, so highly, highly recommend that you use a software tool or an experienced nutritionist. So our My Happy Horse nutrition app will take into account all of these factors. So one of the questions it will ask you is, do you have any of these grasses? And it lists the 4 that we've spoken about, and there's a couple of other ones in there as well that it will ask you if your horse has. And from that, and from being able to specify the percentage of those grasses that your horse is eating in its pasture, it will then work out how much oxalate your horse is eating, and then it will know how much calcium your horse needs to balance up that calcium to oxalate ratio. And then you'll be able to see when you put in those amounts of limestone and calcium phosphate and magnesium oxide, or a balancer pellet that you might choose, or a specialised supplement that you might choose, you'll be able to see that the calcium to oxalate ratio plus the calcium to phosphorus ratio plus the calcium to magnesium ratio are all balanced up. Lots of maths, but it makes it so easy because you're not doing any of the calculations. It's just showing you whether what you're entering and what you're feeding your horse is actually meeting all of those requirements. So I've already mentioned a few times how much more dangerous setaria is, and at a minimum, you need to feed approximately 3 times those levels of minerals. It's a massive amount of mineral. It always makes me wonder how on earth we manage to get enough calcium into a horse's diet on setaria ever, because when I calculate out diets for horses on that grass, it's hundreds of grams of raw mineral going in just to balance up their calcium to oxalate ratio, and then all of the other ratios at the same time. So setaria requires a bit more of a sophisticated approach. And in fact, for all of these horses, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you feed some lucerne or alfalfa, same thing, different names for different parts of the world, in the diet, because the lucerne has a double positive effect. So it will bring in calcium because it's very high in calcium, and it will also, because it's a forage and it fills your horse up, it'll also reduce the amount of the high-oxalate pasture that your horse is eating. So it increases calcium, it reduces oxalate, and it immediately makes it easier to get your horse's calcium to oxalate ratio balanced. So if your horse is on setaria, I'm going to suggest that you're going to need to feed lucerne to your horse on a daily basis in order to just get the calcium, the natural calcium level up enough and the oxalate level down enough to be able to practically feed them enough mineral to prevent disease. Hopefully that makes sense. But lucerne is so important for horses on these types of pastures. It means that you don't have to add so much straight mineral to their feed, because it is a little bit difficult sometimes to mix that mineral into a feed, and if the horses are only getting small amounts of feed because they're on so much pasture, which is often the case for horses that are at highest risk of these conditions are usually the horses that aren't doing very much because they're just existing on pasture and they're not normally getting much supplementary feed. And that's when your problems will start happening. If you've got a horse, let's say endurance horse, and they're on kikuyu pasture, but you're also giving them some hay and they get a fortified hard feed, the risk is lower. You still absolutely need to check that diet to make sure that you do get enough calcium into that diet. But the fact that they're getting feed and forage other than the pasture is going to help them a lot, and it is going to keep them a lot safer. So be aware that your horses at high risk are the ones that are out on pasture. You're not necessarily supplementary feeding them because they're definitely maintaining condition on pasture alone, but it also makes it a little trickier to get enough of the minerals into them because you don't have much of a feed to mix it into. So I hope that helps. I hope I haven't freaked you out too much, but I'd much rather do that than have you end up with a horse that has a catastrophic fracture, because it truly is heartbreaking. And I've seen it too many times, always for me after the fact, and we work out sort of afterwards what actually happened to that horse, or, I end up coming into a stud farm that is losing lots of mares and I have to help them work through, getting their diet balanced to stop it happening again. So please go and identify your grasses. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, just identify your grasses. You're probably pretty safe if you're in Canada. You may not have those grasses, but anywhere outside of the frozen north or the frozen south, please do go and get your grasses identified so that you know whether you need to be aware of this or not. And if you've got a horse that's affected, do seek out help. Come and find us here at My Happy Horse. You can download the app. It's on the App Store now. It will identify in the diet for you whether your horse's diet is balanced or not, and it will help you keep that diet balanced into the future so that you're always keeping them safe. It's a condition that catches so many people out just because we're not aware of it. So I hope that makes you aware of it enough to be able to be confident in identifying whether your horse is at risk and keeping them safe in the future. If you have found this episode useful, I would absolutely love you to share it. And please, if you know anyone in coastal regions, and particularly warm, wet coastal regions where the risk is highest, do share this with them. And please follow our podcast. It helps us get found by lots of other people and lots of other horse owners who might need this information. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you next time. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse Virtual Equine Nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.